Hello everyone and welcome to our webinar today. It's on the prevention of counterfeit parts and material, with specific focus on the aerospace standards. It says on the title 9100, but it can apply to 9120 and 9110. Okay, so as you'll see from these little images, both are for the same part, and the one on the left of the screen is counterfeit and the one on the right is a known good part. And it's quite difficult to actually see which one would be counterfeit without full investigation. So the counterfeit industry is very, very large. Just to give you an idea, there's reported 3,000 incidents to the FAA over the last few years, and EASA, the European arm, have 17,000 pages of products which are suspected counterfeit parts. Now everyone thinks it's electronics. When we go into audit organisations, many of them just disregard the counterfeit element and believe that it's just for electronics, which is incorrect. 82% of all reportings of counterfeit parts are electronics. The rest of it is materials and things like that. The parts themselves run into the millions. It's a very, very big industry. The most popular part, which was investigated and reported as counterfeit, was bought for 2 cents, and on average they sold for $38 a piece, which equaled, as a rough estimate, a gross profit of $2 million US dollars per month based on the volumes that they know are out there. So it's very big business for counterfeits. It's raw material as well. There's a few well-known stories and cases of counterfeit raw material. Most recently, Kobe Steel in Japan, very large manufacturer of raw steel, well known in the industry, and they were also caught producing fraudulent and counterfeit raw material. As we run through today, we'll kind of show the risks that are associated, what you can do to try and prevent counterfeit parts entering the supply chain, and especially when addressing it within your management system. As said, a lot of organizations, when we go in and audit them, they will simply disregard the counterfeit element, or they'll do a very, very small part of it and believe that covers them. But through our experience, it's a weak area in most organizations' management system. As you may gather, most counterfeit parts come into any organizations via the supply chain that they have. It's not necessarily something they're doing internally, bringing counterfeit parts into the supply chain, but it will come in through their own supply chain themselves. So it's important to have a robust system in place for managing counterfeit parts and the supply chain that you have to prevent these coming into your business, because you will be responsible for bringing those in. And it will be your name that goes through to the customers. They'll be looking at you. And we have got examples of some clients that we certify that have lost quite a lot of money because they've had to go out and fix the parts that have been put out into the field, where they brought in electronic parts which were counterfeit, and their customer, doesn't matter to them, they just make you go and fix them. And where you got the counterfeit parts from, they're not going to help you. So it can actually cost you a lot of money to your business. So we'll run through a few things that you can do with your supply chain just to make sure you're having a robust system in place to mitigate those risks. So counterfeit parts are a big problem in the aerospace industry, and it gets worse depending on how big the supply chain is. and where you are in that supply chain. It's such a complex process, the aerospace industry, and the supply chain goes many layers down. And the further down it goes in the supply chain, the higher the risk is of counterfeit parts entering. So you need to be aware of where you are within the supply chain up to the end users and the primes, and where the potential risks are. And it also depends on what you're doing. Are you a design organization? Are you a distributor? Are you an OEM or a subsystem manufacturer? The biggest issue that we have with counterfeit parts entering the supply chain is down the bottom here, where we get the aftermarket, the distributors. Not everyone is going to be an authorized distributor, and you tend to go onto the black market or eBay, things like that. There are systems such as eBay for aerospace industry where parts, you can procure them as and when needed, and very little will be known about those suppliers. And you have to do some due diligence on those organizations to make sure that you're not bringing in anything that's counterfeit. So it's very important to understand where you are in the supply chain and where the biggest risks are, which we'll come to a little bit more later on. So depending on where you are in the supply chain will depend on your supplier controls that you have in place. The further you are on the supply chain, so if you're in the middle, upper tiers, you will focus on your supply chain and who they are and where you're procuring things from. But you'll look at maybe one layer down, and you'll be focusing on your suppliers and how they are managing their supply chain. That's where your focus will be. If you're on the lower tier of the supply chain, you just look at what your customer needed and you try to get them out to them quick to service their needs. And you don't necessarily look below yourselves to see how you should be managing your supply chain. So when you're looking at your organization, you need to think about where you are and where the risks are, and what your current systems are that you have in place for managing your suppliers, and are there any weaknesses in that? Think about the whole supply chain, the chain of custody that your parts go through. So if you're a design organization as well, you need to be thinking about how the purchasing is going to take place around the parts that you're designing into your process. Are there any testing needs? Where are the risks on those? What are the obsolescence requirements? Things like that, which we'll come to again in a little bit later. So obsolescence, because of the life cycle, mostly of aerospace industry, think of the MOD specifically, they've got parts or aircraft out there, or can be submarines, anything where things have been operating for over 40 years. And I believe it was the F-35, the most recent aircraft. Parts on that aircraft were obsolete 12 times before it actually went into production. Things change very, very quickly in technology. So chips that you may recommend or put into your design process can become obsolete very, very quickly. And we have things in Europe currently such as REACH for chemicals, which is banning certain chemicals. So it's really causing problems for obsolescence. So when you look at the little model down the below on the right, shows a typical life cycle of an aerospace part. It'll hit a peak of maturity, and as it starts to decline, the risk of obsolescence becomes higher. When things become obsolete, it then forces organizations to move out to just source those from anywhere they can do, because a customer has asked for it. The customer may not realize that that part is no longer available. So you as an organization will just go and try and find that part wherever you can. And that part may be counterfeit. It may not be a genuine part. So it's being aware of those risks. Another reason which can create counterfeit parts is when parts do come to the end of their life cycle, it's very costly sometimes to ramp up production to make those parts. Sometimes you don't have production going anymore for that. So things get a long long duration lead time. When those lead times are so long, your customer just needs them, and they'll force you again to go onto the black market to find those parts just because you need to get them in a short lead time. You tell them it's going to be 12 months, they'll say it's not good enough, and then you'll then just try and find it as quickly as you can from any source. And when you start doing that, that's where there can be really high risks involved in those suppliers. So you need to communicate those back to your customers, the risks and the potential lead time that's realistic for those. And likewise, your customers need to understand that some things will take a long lead time if they're no longer manufactured on a day-to-day basis. Okay, so within each organization, you'll have certain areas in the business that will have their part to play in counterfeit. If you're in engineering, they need to have good risk identification, analysis, and mitigations. They need to be understanding the design specifications that identify parts from suppliers, which will give a high degree of supply chain assurance, not going off to any suppliers that you can to get the parts cheaper or quicker. It's understanding those needs that you need to build into the product. Purchasing has a huge part to play. Many organizations will just say our goods in department, they've been trained on counterfeit parts, but really, what about your purchasing team, the people that are buying the parts? They're sourcing them. Are they aware of counterfeit parts and the measures they have to put in place? And also the evaluation techniques. They should be specifying to goods receiving people on what inspection needs to take place to reassure them that those are genuine parts. And planning, likewise, they need to be made aware. Do they have to do testing in line? How do they detect if there is a counterfeit part? Sometimes the material, especially, you don't really know it's counterfeit until you start cutting it. You've asked for some type of material, you put it on the machine, start cutting it, and it's just not cutting right, how you're used to it performing as you cut it. So as many people need to be made aware in the organization on what part they can play on counterfeit detection. So these are the main clauses in the standards that in the AS9100 and 9120 standard that refers to counterfeit parts prevention or obsolescence. Now, it's not all areas, but these are the key ones listed here: operational plan and control, prevention of counterfeit parts, design, and then purchasing, a couple of clauses there for purchasing, post-delivery activities, control of changes, and control of non-conforming outputs. So I'm going to cover these elements today just to give you a bit more information on what each requirement is needing. Everyone just focuses on 843 when we go out and audit them, and sometimes 842, but really they need to have proper planning in place, proper awareness to really mitigate the risk of counterfeit parts. Operational planning and control. So the clause of the standard is there: organizations shall plan, implement and control the processes needed to meet the requirements for the provision of products and services, and to implement the actions determined in clause 6 by A, determining the requirements for the products and services. And then we've got this note. Now this isn't the full clause here, I've just put in the relevant parts. Determination of requirements for the products and services should include consideration of product obsolescence, recycling or final disposal of the product at the end of its life cycle. So the second point is quite interesting, and it links in with mostly what happens to the part at the end of its life. So it's not necessarily broken or faulty or anything like that. It's come to its natural end of life, it needs to be removed from an aircraft. What happens to it? How is it then disposed of? And likewise, the product obsolescence. So this all comes down to the planning. Your planning may be different depending on if you're designing or not. But likewise, it can be if you're putting parts into another assembly that are going to become obsolete, or at some point will end its life and removing. So it's not just if you're designing a design organization, you may be assembling parts as well. So you need to be aware. And all this is down to planning and thinking about what you want to do. It's not necessarily going to be something that you have to document for this specific element, but we will be trying to understand your thinking behind anything that you've decided to do. 814. This is the main clause of the standard that talks about prevention of counterfeit parts. And again, most people just look at this and they just refer to their goods in process, which really isn't adequate enough. This whole clause here is about proper planning of what you are going to do as an organization for the prevention of counterfeit parts. And you'll see all these notes that are giving hints to the types of areas you need to look at. Training of appropriate persons in the awareness and prevention of counterfeit parts. Don't just train people at goods receiving. There should be a global awareness of counterfeit parts and what role everybody has in preventing those parts. So you've got people in production, making them aware how to detect things. You've got the purchasing department need to be aware of who they should be buying from, things like that, the risks that they pose by just trying to find it cheaper or quicker elsewhere. And also management should be aware. Some people aren't in the day-to-day operations of the business, managing directors or finance directors, people like that. They should also have an awareness of counterfeit parts and the risks. Application of a parts obsolescence monitoring program. That is being aware of things that are becoming obsolete, such as items that are on the REACH register. Don't just rely on your customers to tell you alternatives. They'll put things onto drawings. You need to be aware of what's on drawings that are becoming obsolete, and you should feed back to them to make them aware. They may not be aware of what's coming up, but you may be. So you need to monitor avenues like that, such as the REACH program. And people also contact their suppliers. If there's specific parts on there, material, electronic components, things like that, you can ask your suppliers if they're the manufacturers of them, what their plan is, what the life cycle is of these components. Externally provided product from original or authorized manufacturers. This comes down to the purchasing, which we'll cover in quite a bit of detail shortly. It's really understanding the risks and who you're buying from and the controls you can put in place around those. Traceability of parts and components to the original or authorized manufacturers. People sometimes will just get a certificate of conformity, one step back. Well, it doesn't show the whole traceability through the chain of custody. That's something organizations should be aware of. And is a certificate of conformity adequate, or do you need meal certificates, things like that? You need to be aware of the whole chain of custody and what requirements and documents you need. Verification of test methods to detect counterfeit parts. How are you going to detect them? Again, you should have an idea and an understanding on what you're going to do, and to implement those within your management system, which we'll cover in a bit more detail shortly. Monitoring of counterfeit parts, reporting from external sources. This is a good one. People have told EASA, FAA, there's another number of organisations which we'll come to, where they report counterfeit parts, you should have a system in place for reporting, which we'll cover in shortly, but you should also monitor those lists. They're free to look at. You can put in your part numbers and it will tell you if there's known counterfeit parts out there. Likewise, you can put in suppliers. So if there's known suppliers that have been known to put counterfeit parts out into the supply chain, you should be checking those lists. Are you impacted? Are any of the products you procure on those lists? It's quite a weak process that not many organizations are even aware of when we go and audit them. And quarantine and reporting a suspect or detected counterfeit parts. So the reporting, which we just briefly discussed, which we'll cover, quarantine, holding it, making sure it can't be used, even if it's suspect. It doesn't need to be counterfeit at that time, you just suspect it's counterfeit. And we've had a number of organizations quite recently get material tested, it's failed, and one of them put it back into the supply chain, which was a major issue, but then the other one did control it, they verified it, they quarantined it so it couldn't enter the supply chain until they fully investigated, and it actually turned out it wasn't counterfeit, it was just an issue in the paperwork. However, they controlled it correctly just to protect themselves and protect their customers. So all of these things you need to think about when you're planning your counterfeit parts prevention program. Don't just skip over it and go straight to the purchasing element. There's a lot more things to think about. Design and development inputs. Now, not every organization is going to design, obviously, but when you are designing, think about the potential consequences of obsolescence. Don't design products where some of the components or materials or compounds or any process is due to become obsolete in a few years' time. If they're going to become obsolete before your product is going to finish its life cycle, then you should be looking at alternatives, things that are going to stand the test of time for your product itself. Don't design things that in a few years' time will become obsolete, because then that forces the suppliers of those parts that you're giving your design to go out to just seek products, and the chances are there's going to be counterfeit parts on the supply chain, because these counterfeiters know that these parts are still out there, that you still need them. So if the demand's there, they will still create them. Post-delivery activities. So this is the activities that happen once you've shipped parts. You just need to be aware of these two elements, I in here, which talks about warranties, maintenance, and obsolescence there. You need to be understanding if your customer comes back of obsolete requirements, if they ask some questions, but also if you've shipped something out and then something does become obsolete, how are you going to replace those parts? Seeking alternatives, things like that. When you go to repair or warranty or things like that, you need to be aware of those. Problems detected after delivery include investigation. If you find something is counterfeit down the line after you've shipped the product, you've already shipped something off to the customers, it's knowing what to do about investigating and reporting that there could be potential counterfeit parts out in the supply chain that your customers are using, and it's about getting those back or providing the traceability information so that it can be properly assessed. Control of non-conforming outputs. This is quite a simple one. Counterfeit or suspect counterfeit parts shall be controlled to prevent re-entry into the supply chain. As I said earlier, if there are counterfeit parts or suspected counterfeit parts, it's about quarantining those, making sure they don't go back to the supplier. The material one that I had a client of mine detect that was counterfeit, they just sent it back to the supplier. And their argument was, well, it wasn't a high risk part. The part we were doing wasn't critical, so the material didn't matter. Well, that might have been the case for them, but what about the next person that buys that material? It may be a critical part, so you should not ever send it back to your supplier. And if it is counterfeit, then you need to inform the authorities, which we'll come to shortly. So we'll come on to the risk hierarchy, which is something organizations need to do to assess the risk of counterfeit parts coming into their supply chain. What we find when organizations assess the risk of their management system, they will always just assess the risk of the supplier assessment. They don't actually think about the other elements which can impact your decision on whether something is high or low risk. You'll see these three bars here in blue. One is looking at the product itself. Is it critical or is it non-critical? Are lives dependent on it or are they not? So you should assess the risk for that element. Then you come along to the next blue element, and it's, is the supplier an original equipment manufacturer, an OCM or component manufacturer, or are they a supplier with known issues? So are they on these alert lists? Are they known as providing counterfeit parts? We'll go into a bit more detail, but there's the food chain that this stands for sources of supply, going from the lowest to the highest risk, and you need to understand where you're buying your materials or components from, and is there a greater risk? And then the last blue column, which most people do, but possibly not in sufficient detail, is the supplier themselves. Quite often everyone will say, oh, I've known this supplier for 10 years, he's great, never had a problem. Well, okay, that may be part of it, but that's not everything that you need to consider for the risk, because it's they may not change, they may be supplier, but maybe where they're buying things from, maybe they've changed, maybe that's where counterfeit parts are coming in further down the supply chain. So it's not just your direct supplier you need to be aware of, it's the other people that are feeding into them. And depending on the risk will dictate what you need to do. So these two columns here in the green, you can kind of consider what you're going to do to mitigate the risks of the counterfeit parts, depending on the risks you've identified. Do you do a visual test? Do you just an inspection? Do you put it through actual tests? Do you x-ray? Do you sample inspect? Anything like that. You can dictate depending on the risk of that part, material, component, whatever it may be, but you need to fully assess the risks first before you get to decide what you're actually going to do. Really, purchasing needs to be aware, because they're possibly going to be the ones that dictate to goods receiving and what they need to do to verify those parts when they come in. There's many techniques that you can use, which we'll come to shortly. But it's important that you assess the risk on these three blue pillars, not just one of them. So I've put the three blue pillars into this little hierarchy. It's just something I drew up. So we got application and product, source of supply, and supplier assessment. And these are just my own ideas, highest risk at the bottom, lowest risk at the top. And I've just highlighted for application and product, non-critical applications. So this could be, let's just say, things on a tray on a seat, not necessarily life dependent. Okay. And then we come down the list and the risk gets higher. So then we get to the highest risk at the bottom, life dependent applications. Could be parts on wings, parts on landing gear, could be the oxygen systems, flight controls, things like that. and then we get safety critical, less of a higher risk but still high risk, and then mission critical, and then you can just work your way through. And then we go to source of supply. Lowest risk would be buying directly from the original material manufacturer or equipment or component, depending on what your products are. They'll be the lowest risk. Going to the OEMs is always the best option. And then you can come down a level to authorized distributors. So these are organizations who are authorized directly from the equipment manufacturers to sell their products on their behalf. Still low risk, but there is a greater risk because they could still bring in counterfeit parts into the supply chain there. And then we come all the way down to unknown sources and reporting source alerts issued on the supplier. So unknown sources, this could be where you're using organizations on the things like the eBay, the equivalents for aerospace industry. You don't know these sources. You're just looking for the part, you're Googling it, you're finding anything you can, any means necessary to find those parts. And then the highest risk of them all is if there is a known issue with that supplier. So that's where you have to look at these lists of reporting to see if there's any known issues. If you're using those suppliers or those parts, then you know your risk is greater and you need to put additional measures in place. These are never saying not to use someone, it's just you need to apply different controls depending on the risk of the product or the supplier. So you can still use people of unknown sources, no one's ever saying that, but we expect some additional controls to be put in place, which we'll cover, to limit the risk and mitigate the risk of those parts being counterfeit from those unknown sources. And then last we come over to the supplier assessment, which is what a lot of people do already, but possibly not in sufficient detail. So the lowest risk, maybe you go out to the suppliers, you audit them yourselves, you check how they're monitoring counterfeit parts and things like that. Next level down, there are specialist standards, AS9081, AS5553. These are special approvals for organizations for counterfeit prevention, things like that. So what approvals do they have? Next level down, we've got AS9100, 9120, 9110 suppliers. You know that they should themselves have a counterfeit program in place, so the risk will be less. And then we follow down the chain, 9001, and then new organizations. Think about where they are. You need to score, yeah, say score, you can score each of those three pillars to determine what the risk of counterfeit parts are coming into your supply chain. Personally, I'd quite do a simple thing such as non-critical applications. On the application bit, I'll give that score a 1, and then short product life expectancy, I could go a 2, and then just count those up. And then you could count the results for each of the columns up, give you a result of, let's say, 15, and you can say anything above 15 is high risk, anything below is low, things like that. You create what you feel is necessary for your management system. The important message here is don't just base it on supplier assessment. Think about the risks, where you're buying it from, what the application is that your products are being used for. And then you can determine what controls you need to put in place to mitigate counterfeit parts. So just a little supplier monitoring process that I put in place really around the suppliers. A bit more about monitoring of suppliers rather than counterfeit, but it kind of gives an example of what pigeonhole you can put these organizations in. So I've just said they could be critical suppliers, they could be supplying consumables, and then non-critical. So by scoring up all those elements, you can then focus on the critical suppliers. You don't need to monitor all the other suppliers. If there's a high risk of counterfeit, they should go in critical, and then you can focus your attention on those suppliers in that little bundle there. Non-critical and consumables, maybe you don't do anything. If it's not critical, we're not going to do any testing or anything like that. So tailor your inspection, check-in and things like that depending on the risk of that supplier, what pigeonhole you've put them in. You can develop this as far as you like, really. But if they're an OEM, maybe that then becomes, not as important to your business in terms of the risk of counterfeit parts. So maybe you don't need to monitor them as closely. If there's a higher risk, then you need to monitor them a little bit more closely. Maybe you go and visit them, things like that. So change management. This has caught a few organizations out, and specifically one of our clients that were putting electronic components into a larger product that got out into the supply chain that they were supplying. I think it was about $1 million per kit that they were shipping out. And this is where it's important to understand the supply chain and any changes. So for, I think it was something like 7-8 years, they'd been buying their components off of the same supplier all that time, no changes. All of a sudden they started getting failures out in the field. So they went back to their supplier and said, these are failing, what's happening? They said, oh, nothing's changed our end. They went to their the exporter that they were buying off of, because these guys are importers, and they had in fact changed their supply. That's how the counterfeit parts came into the business, really. So our client was only assessing one level down on their supply chain. They hadn't properly communicated the requirements for their supplier not to change anything. They can't change their own supplier, anything like that. They hadn't communicated those terms. And then that supplier themselves had went off to find a cheaper product, which looked exactly the same. The only way they detected that these were counterfeit components, they sent them back to the OEM to inspect, and the OEM x-rayed them and then sent them back and said, they're not our parts, so it's not our problem. End up costing this organization quite a lot of money. So when you're making changes, ensure that you're thinking about the impact of those changes. Do you need approval from anyone? Are you allowed to just change something? The purchasing team, they may just go and try and find a cheaper product elsewhere or get it quicker. They need to understand the risk of making those changes. And likewise, think about your supply chain. Don't allow them to make changes without notifying you. A lot of organizations put in their terms and conditions, don't make changes. But I'd say 90% of terms and conditions aren't communicated correctly. They'll just say on their purchase order that they're available on request or on the website. Now, if you put your hand up and said, yes, we definitely make sure everyone reads those, then you can sleep at night. But in my experience, a lot of people will not go onto the websites. They won't download them. They won't read them. They don't actually understand what's in the terms and conditions. So it should be something you should be focusing on with your suppliers and your supply chain. Are they aware that they can't make changes without informing you, coming through you before? So raw materials, this is one of the new elements in the standard. There's a reason why this part was put into the standard, and it's because of the counterfeit raw material out there. Now, there is a specific standard that you can download and implement. It's not one that's certifiable as a whole. We don't come out and assess it, but it's a good standard for you to read and understand, and that's AS9174-A. -A is the revision. I believe it's currently going through a review, but I think it's been sitting in review for ages. So we'll ask organizations when we go and assess them, what are you doing about raw material testing? And 9 times out of 10, people say nothing. We're not doing anything, either A, because it's not electronics and we don't believe it's counterfeit, or 2, they just think there's a huge cost to it. I would generally automatically raise a non-conformance on that. And I'm not saying you have to go out and get material tested. What I'm trying to assess is, when would you? How have you come to that conclusion that you're not going to get it tested? And it sort of feeds back to this risk management approach. How have you assessed the risk of counterfeit material and determined when you would go and get it tested and when you wouldn't? The reason why the requirement was put into the standard was not to check that you've got, as argument's sake, 6081 raw material. It's actually to check that the material certificate you were given by your supplier, distributor, the mill, whoever, is legitimate. So you should be assessing the material against that material certificate. So the mill cert should have on there the composition. It's not going to be 100% because it depends on where the cut was made to do the testing, but it should be quite close enough for you to evaluate that, yeah, this raw material matches this product. So there's certain things you can do to first mitigate your risk, but then you should also consider getting some tested depending on the risk. So simple things you can do: lot and or date codes on the packaging. They do not match the lot or date codes on the parts. Okay, comparing them, checking the paperwork, reviewer logos, trademarks and other identifying marks to ensure they match the manufacturers. Everyone can knock up some logos nowadays that look very similar, so trying to detect if they are legitimate logos. Changes or irregularities in the documentation and or paper trail. This is always a good one. Some people will buy raw material from a distributor. That might be a smaller distributor of raw material. They would buy the raw material from another distributor, and they will likewise have bought it from possibly a mill or another distributor. And what organizations tend to do, because they don't want you seeing where they've bought it from, is they will take the analysis results and copy and paste it onto their own paperwork. Now, because you would have asked for mill information or the composition or something like that on your purchase order, what you should be asking for is the original mill certificate, because anyone can make up the numbers and copy and paste it onto their own documentation. It doesn't show the full traceability, and it doesn't give me confidence of where they bought this material from. They can just make those numbers up themselves. So make sure you are obtaining the original mill certificates. This should be done at goods in check-in, but again, purchasing should be aware of what they should be requesting to ensure they're asking for the correct paperwork to be sent in. Part number marked on the material does not match the part numbers on the purchase order and certifications. That's quite a simple check just to make sure everything lines up, which is what most people will do. Materials are inconsistent with the description. That's quite easy to do as well. Again, a visual check. The color's different, the shade's different, numbering could be different, things like that. Serial number issues or duplication of unique identifier. I've seen this a few times where mill certificates come in with raw material. They all look good. And it's only when we looked back over 5 years that we realized the exact same mill certificate was being issued. Now, unless that mill churned out millions upon millions of tons in one go, really they were providing certificates that weren't legitimate. So we had a big non-conformance there, and they went back and they ended up changing suppliers. I won't go into the details, but check that you are getting up-to-date MIL certificates and not something that was produced maybe 5 years ago and it's been the same number throughout. And that's where your raw material testing can come into it. Now over on the right we have non-destructive testing and destructive testing, the types of things you can do. Again, you don't have to go out and do all of these. It's all based on the risk. Just keep thinking risk, base everything on risk. You can get these XRF guns nowadays. I mean, they're about £25,000, so they're not cheap, which can quickly test the raw material. But the chances are you're just going to need to send something off as needed to get tested. And it's not that expensive when you're doing sort of low numbers. You're probably only going to be doing 1 or 2 a year or something like that. Again, just base it on the risk. If you determine that there's no risk based on your products and the supply chain and things like that, you don't need to go and get it tested. We would expect some kind of visual checks and things like that. You don't have to then go off and do some testing specifically. We just want to know you've got a process there. So verification methods for electronic components, this can get more expensive in terms of testing and checking. Some of these specifically come from AS9181, which is a standard that we can certify to. We're, I believe, the only certification body in the world that can actually do this, and it's specifically for electronic components, and it's not necessarily for the OEMs or the authorized distributors. This is to help people that are buying things from the likes of eBay, things like that. So it's what controls you can put in place to verify that what you're buying is a genuine part. So there's minimum requirements that you would need to do. Similar to the raw material, you're going to check the documentation and packaging. You're going to do a visual inspection, checking for marks, things like that. As you see from the example here, it's understanding what serial numbers should be shown, how they're shown, the unique numbering system that they use, the labeling that's on those components. You can do those as a bare minimum. And then depending on what you've got, equipment wise, there's XRF machines that can X-ray inspection to check inside the components themselves. You can do a delid and decapsulation, which is where you just take the top layer off. So you need to destroy at least one component just to then verify internally if it's correct. What you've asked for is a genuine part, and inside there will be telltale signs, how good the soldering is. There's distinctive marks inside the components which will tell you if it's genuine parts, things like that. So there's minimum bits you can do there, which can get expensive, but if you're using a lot of electronic components, it's a worthwhile investment, especially if you get sort of X-ray machines and things like that. And then over on the right, there's additional tests as required by the standard. So, by the customer. So the customer, when they know you've got AS9081, they will dictate certain tests to do. This is generally based on the risk of that component, what they're using it for. You may need to do burn tests, thermal testing, electrical testing. There's all kinds of tests that you can do, which I won't go into huge amounts of detail for time, but there's lots of methods that you can do. And as I said, this is mostly aimed at higher risk areas of your supply chain. You don't need to do this if you're buying it from the OEM or the authorized distributors. This is when you're buying it from unknown sources and where it's known to be counterfeit parts. You need to do additional tests and checking to ensure that what you're buying is genuine. Just a little short summary. So QMS leadership. Leaders need to be made aware of the counterfeit parts, the requirements, what they should be doing, and they need to have some impact on the management system. It needs to come from the top down to the bottom. As we know with all management systems, need to get management buy-in, so they need to be aware of the risks. At the end of the day, they're the ones going to be in the docks if something happens. Get involvement from various departments throughout the value stream. Don't just rely on goods receiving or a quality person or something that to identify the risks of counterfeit parts. You should get people from various different avenues of the business to have input into that. Risk-based thinking methodology. This is probably the number one bit that people need to focus more attention on. Understanding the risks to the business, where the risks are for counterfeit parts, ensuring those are embedded, those techniques are embedded into the organization. This is still a newish requirement, risk-based thinking in the standard. It's been out for quite a few years now, but organizations need to start developing these a little bit further, not just ticking a box, fully understanding where their risks are. Train all personnel, not just goods in. Classic one, that is, it's not just goods in that have an impact on the supply of counterfeit parts. It's a lot of people, as we've discussed. Culture change, that takes a few years. Just raising awareness, keep people up to date on counterfeit parts. You can have a look at lists of counterfeit parts. You can put these out on notice boards. You just keep raising awareness for people. System for reporting counterfeit parts. So you'll see here I've put GIDEP, EASA, ERAI reporting, and there are others such as the FAA. These are just some areas, organizations that you can report counterfeit parts to, or suspect counterfeit parts, and you can also check their websites for known counterfeit parts, things like that. These organizations can actually support you if you have got the suspect counterfeit parts. They can guide you through it, but you need to be aware of these systems. You need to have a system for reporting to those, or at least awareness for your personnel on what happens if you do have counterfeit parts. And likewise, have a look at those lists for any known counterfeit parts which you may be supplying. And there's obviously the standards that you can implement as an organization to reassure yourself and to give your customers some comfort in your management system being robust enough to be aware of counterfeit parts and the risks, and put in good avoidance programs. Internal audit management, process-based audits, which have been around for a number of years. Do you base those on risk? What clauses you audit when? How risky is those elements to your business? What you need to do? Maybe you need to give enhanced training to the audit team. Some people just have ISO 9001 internal auditor training. Some people will have AS9100 internal auditor training. Maybe you need to develop that further. Maybe you need to put people on the full lead auditor courses, or the official AATT course for aerospace auditors. Or you can just make them aware of the standard requirements such as 6081. Buy a copy, give it to them, make sure they are understanding the risk of counterfeit parts. Are they fully auditing the supply chain when they're doing audits? Are they understanding the risks which the business is exposed to? So just as a closing summary, ensure you're thinking about risk-based thinking within your management system. Are your counterfeit prevention processes effective or just compliant? So a number of years, many people have just been compliant with it. We can tick a box, say, yes, you've thought about it, but really it's about, is it effective? Can you sleep safely at night and knowing that you have done all you can to prevent counterfeit parts entering the supply chain? Ensure you're connecting the threads during your internal audit. What that talks about is internal auditing of the processes, linking them between. If you're out on the shop floor, pick up some products and then link that back through purchasing to where you bought those products for. Don't just go out and audit purchasing separate to production and pick products at random, because it's not really an effective process. Supply chain management. I think this is something everyone can work on. Are your supply chain, is it being managed effectively? Have you really thought about the risks, how you're managing those suppliers, what you need to do for those suppliers, and work with them on a relationship? Do they understand the needs themselves? If they're not AS certified, do they really understand counterfeit parts and the risks that they pose? Because you rely a lot on your suppliers. And think about the product and process risks when you're doing your risk assessment of suppliers, not just how long you've known them. It's think about what the applications are for that product. Is it a high risk application? So that's the end. I've whizzed through quite a lot of some of those elements. I will be putting a more detailed article out on the NQA website very shortly, hopefully this week, if not next week, which will go into a little bit more detail on some of those areas. Obviously, we only had an hour, so I couldn't cover everything in huge detail. Now, there is a questions box, which I should have mentioned earlier. If anyone has any questions, you'll see a little box on the screen. Feel free to enter any questions. We've got a few minutes left of the webinar, but if I do shut it down and there's any questions, you can just contact info@nqa.com, or we've got a dedicated email address for aerospace team, which is aerospace@nqa.com. Feel free to ask us at any time. All of our auditors that NQA use have been given this same training, but in a little bit more detail. So they're fully equipped in understanding the risk of counterfeit parts, and they can obviously help you and give you some guidance to a certain degree during any assessments which you may have from NQA. So thank you, and jot down any questions if you have them. I'll leave it open for a few minutes, and if not, I'll see you next time.